and philanthropist for over 30 years. And Steve Wozniak truly has helped shape the landscape of computing and computer technology around the world. He, of course, is one of the designers of Apple's first line of products and influenced the incredibly popular Macintosh computer system. For his achievements at Apple, Wozniak was awarded the National Medal of Technology by the President of the United States in 1985, the highest honor bestowed on America's leading innovators. We are truly thrilled to have Steve join us here at the ASI Orlando. Please give a very warm welcome to Steve Wozniak, and welcome back to the stage, Tim Andrews.
Well, we met when he was in high school, and somehow I had been 4 years ahead of him. In high school, we had no computers. I taught myself how to design any computer in the world in 2 days. I wanted to be the engineer par excellence. Computers was in my soul. There were no books about it, so I had to be self-taught. I had to work very, very hard. It took a long time to figure out how do you design a computer with these little decision-making chips. And so I was very good at that. Now, when I met Steve Jobs, I was actually building a computer that 5 years later, other people were going to be trying to build their own computers like that and sell them. So basically, I think I of myself as having a 5-year head start. But I met Steve Jobs because his friend said, you should meet Steve Jobs because he knows this digital electronics and he plays pranks in school, and I was known for both of those. So Steve and I met on the sidewalk, and we're describing the pranks we've done and the projects we've built, and so we became really best friends. And he was a different person than you know. There were basically 3 big phases of Steve Jobs' life, during the time I knew him. But just early phase, we would joke, we'd go to concerts together. I showed him all my Bob Dylan liner notes because I had albums, and Steve had no money, and that was good. I had a job as an engineer. Right out of high school, I could always get a job. I was designing the hottest product of the time, the HP scientific calculators, and I did not have a college degree. They interviewed me and just an instant offer to work for them. So I had it easy, but Steve had no real abilities or good grades or any of that kind of stuff. He would just go around and take little jobs trying to sell stuff, usually electronic parts. And because he had no money, every once in a while he'd come back into town. I drove him to college in Oregon, and he'd come back into town and he'd see what the latest thing I built for fun was. I started building video games, and actually it started with the little devices that could make free phone calls called blue boxes. And those, we had a lot of fun with those, but Steve Jobs would always say, how could he, the way we envisioned it, a fun device for the home, because they only could see boring devices for engineers.
So how did you stay innovative? That first 5 years, new products, new ideas, was that really out of your head, or did customers talk to you?
No, those 5 years, no. I was just a person who was such a geek, I'd never have a chance of a girlfriend or a wife or parties at night. So when I finished my engineering work in the daytime at Hewlett-Packard, come home, watch Star Trek, have a TV dinner, and then I'd get to work on my own designs. I saw Pong in a bowling alley. Oh my gosh. I know everything about analog television from my electronics days. I was a ham radio operator in 6th grade, and then I knew everything digital possible. I could design anything with chips and use fewer chips than anyone else, so I built my own Pong. And Steve turned that into basically a job for himself at Atari, even though he didn't do any design. He never was an engineer or a programmer. He kind of felt guilty about it, even in his last days. He talked to me and I said, no. Having the marketing abilities, understanding people, what they want, what engineers you can believe, and being able to manage, that's much more valuable.
So is that sort of how you split your roles? You were the innovator and the...
Oh yeah, I would design all these things, and then he would usually be up in Oregon living on a hippie commune type thing, but he'd come into town, and one time actually he was working for Atari for a while. He took my Pong game down, got hired there, but he told him he would design a game, but he couldn't design anything. That was the problem. He knew electronics a bit, he knew how to solder, and he knew how to look at a circuit, follow it. He was, on a step of a technician, but he wasn't like an engineer. So he came to me and says, we gotta build this thing. He needed money to buy his way into the hippie commune. He says, you want to design this game for Atari, a one-player Pong game? And Nolan Bushnell, the owner of Atari, wants it. And I said, oh gosh, it would just fulfill my heart to build a game that young people are going to actually play somewhere, you know, a real product. Wow, greatest thing of my life. And he says, there's a hitch, it has to be done in 4 days. In those days, games weren't software, they were hardware.
So talk to us about the beginning of that and how did that work?
There were two big stages. One was a little two-person partnership with no money. You use the resources you have. You put a few $100s together. What can you do with a few $100s? Steve had worked in surplus electronics stores where he knew how to buy some switches that were surplus from a company. They had too many left over. He could buy them for a penny and know that he could sell them for $6. You know, and I always felt guilty. How could you sell them for $6 and not tell the person you got them for a penny? He says, they don't know, they don't care. So he was the master salesman. And this has been going on. So in the first stage, Apple was the two of us, and the first idea was Steve came into town, and I was actually a hero at my computer club. Don't believe the movies that you see; it's just a bunch of baloney. I would go down to that computer club, and every 2 weeks I'd show off this computer I had invented. I passed out the schematics of it. Apple doesn't own the rights to the Apple I design. It was in the public domain. I'd pass them out. I'd go to other people's houses and help them build their own. This computer that didn't exist. Steve came into town, and I said, you've got to come down to the Homebrew Computer Club. Every 2 weeks I show it off, and I put on my TV set and my keyboard and all this, and he saw all the people gather around. That's when he said, we should start a company, which would mean we should formalize the two of ourselves as a relationship. And he says, what we'll do is we'll make the PC board that helps people build your computer easier, because not everybody is a builder. Not everybody has all the tools to spend 40 hours, or 100 hours soldering together a computer. We'll make it easy for them with this thing called the PC board. It's sort of pre-wired, and they'll get their own chips and plug it in. We'll build the boards for 20 bucks and sell them for 40 bucks. If we sell 50, we'll be able to get our money back. That was how we started this partnership. And we had a third person who had 10% of the company. And he was an amazing person, but after about 9 days, he backed out, sold out for a few $100. It was 10%. Now, later, that partnership, here's the funny thing though, the partnership was established knowing we would sell my computer, which was called the Apple I. Yes, it was the first formula for a working, sellable, useful computer at an affordable price. And everybody looking over my shoulders at the club got the formula out to the rest of the world. We found an angel that believed in us, and he had experience. And he knew everything. You talk about partnerships, listen to older people who've done things before. He told us, here are the people that you hire to set up a technology company. Here's how you have operations and building it, and here's who you hire to test it, and here's what their job responsibilities are, and we'll be a marketing-driven company, and he joined us and funded us, and he ran marketing. He had as much stock as Steve Jobs and myself, but because he was into marketing, he said, you've got to establish like a public image of the company. So we hired an ad agency, and they got all this word out. It was like 2 young people with nothing started the company. But it was kind of like the stage was big time, because I had given away the Apple I. With the Apple II, when I demonstrated to Steve Jobs, I type a number into memory, and it shows up as color on my TV. I type another number, and it shows up as a different color. Amazing things. Nobody ever expected color. It's kind of like color coming to movies. Color was going to come to computers. Nobody could have ever expected it, because I figured out a way, instead of $1,000 to do color by the old methods that was in all the engineering books, I figured out a clever little digital way. Take a little number in a $1 chip. $1. Put that number on the wire into the TV, and I realized, oh my gosh, every TV is going to think it's color. Could have never been in any engineering book on color television, but it worked. And we looked at each other, Steve Jobs and I, ourselves, and we knew this one we weren't going to give away. This was going to be something very big for the world. Because up to then, arcade games from Atari, they were hardware games. Engineers designing chips with wire signals going on, soldering them together, and it would take a man-year to get a game done. And sat down, and in about half an hour, I recreated Breakout in BASIC on my machine. Games were now going to be software. Steve and I were both shaking. We realized that software was going to make the whole game world totally explode. Plus, we had color, we had graphics, and this machine was exceptional. It was going to be the only revenue-making product of Apple for the first 10 years. We developed a computer, but this computer was more like a $2,000 typewriter minus a printer. So we knew some things that it could do. We knew that this digital electronics could do some things for people, and some explorers were going to buy it at first because it was the greatest thing ever. And you could at least write games on it. You could store your games on cassette tape. But over that, I designed printer boards that would connect printers. I had a very clever operating system, the likes of which have never been done before or since. It's just the very start of it going on. So that was quite a shocking experience around then. But I never wanted to move out of engineering. I stayed at the bottom of the org chart to this day. It's just my personality.
And so when did you decide, entrepreneurs often don't know when to leave the company. When did you say, I want to do something else? I'm going to step out of Apple and do something else?
I had obviously done my role. I mean, I created the product before Steve Jobs even saw it. And then we had this idea to start a company based on it. And so I'd really done my job that was, all of Apple's revenues for the first 10 years. And I said, you know what, the company grew and it had a management structure. And a manager in engineering would go to a group of engineers and have them write up a proposal for a product, and they would describe every little piece of software and hardware that would be involved, and it would be 40 pages of description of what they were going to get approved. And then the manager might approve it, get levels of management to approve it. That's not the way I worked. I was like an inventor who wants to go in the laboratory, hook something up that I have an idea for, make some changes that come into my head, and this whole big formalization, documentation, bureaucracy stuff was getting, it just wasn't my style. And sure, I didn't have to work. I was still free in Apple to do what I wanted. I was the only one. But, but it wasn't the same thing. I liked it when 5 little guys or 3 guys sit down at a dinner and you talk over, here's a neat product idea. Wouldn't this be cool? And then some of us go back and we actually create it. We build it. The builders are the important people in my mind. So some of us, I like that. So I went off, I actually left Apple. Well, the first time I left Apple, I had an airplane crash. I was on the Macintosh team. And we had some great people, and I had this airplane crash. And 5 weeks later, I came out of amnesia, a memory problem, and realized, oh my gosh, 5 weeks have passed. And I called up Steve Jobs, and I said, look, you got the most creative people in Apple working on the Macintosh, all my best friends. Burl Smith, he never went to college a day in his life, but he's learned how to design as well as I do. He learned all the techniques. So I'm going to go to college and get my degree. I had 1 year to go. My name was very famous by then, but my face wasn't. So I registered in Berkeley under a fake name, and my diploma says Rocky Raccoon Clark. I really kind of know from what I read, and every once in a while I read one and say, my gosh, the cleverness that somebody thought of doing it this way, and I forget those little ones. So we only remember the big ones, Google and Twitter, Facebook, obviously. And Facebook I really admire, because everybody knows, it really did come out of a norm, That's where the work was done, the development. We didn't develop any new product ideas or anything in this so-called garage that we theoretically came from. But it's that story that somebody with an idea that hasn't been done before, that's kind of because it's not the current thing, a lot of other people ignore it and being huge.
So what are the hot new things that we might be ignoring or not really seeing yet that you think are the next year, 2 years, 3 years out?
Well, obviously we're not ignoring them because we see them all over the place. They talk about wearable technologies and smartwatches, and I'm a little on the negative side because I wanted a smartwatch for 2 years to go to a company outside. My electronics teacher arranged it. And I could program this thing called the computer, and my first big major program was a chess problem called the Knight's Tour of Chess, a knight hitting every space on the chessboard exactly once. It's easier. We always emphasize the human way of doing things being more important than the technology way of doing things. The student message pad, you could write with your own human muscles. You could handwrite on the screen, and it knew what the words were. It knew what it was, and I would take all my notes on it, and it was beautiful. But the first day I had one, I was in the San Francisco airport, flying to Orlando with my kids to Disney World, and I got a phone call. The very first thing I did was on a notepad, a little thing that could record words. I hand wrote a message to myself, a reminder. Sarah, dentist, Tuesday, 2 p.m. I abbreviated. And I was all done. Now, then I saw this little button called Assist. I don't know what Assist means. Some kind of menu, and I clicked it. It opened up the calendar, noting what I had just written. It went Tuesday at 2 p.m. and put in the word dentist, and it grabbed Sarah out of my contact list. And I was stunned, and it changed my life forever. Because I want to speak things the human way, write things the human way, and have the machines understand me. Now, we talk into our machines, we say, what's the highest mountain in Florida? And, we actually get answers that easily just with voice. If I'm texting my wife, text Janet, I'm on stage right now, period. And I love speaking so much because I don't have to think of the methods, just go through procedures. In the old days, it has senses of touch, hearing, sight, of motion. It even knows from GPS where it is in the world, and I don't know that. So these things might become like human. What if they ever got conscious? There's positives and negatives. For example, education. I thought that computers were going to make such a huge difference in education. I taught for 8 years. I taught 5th graders up through 9th graders because it had been a lifetime goal. I kept no press allowed, so it didn't get publicized. But I taught because I felt like, and I was teaching full time, writing my lessons every day and giving them in the afternoon. And education, the computers didn't make a difference as to how smart kids come out of high school or college or whatever. They're coming out with the same brain, and I thought it was going to make a difference. Things understandable. I speak into Siri. It gets the words right, and sometimes it doesn't know what I meant. And then I go to Google, and Google tends to know what I meant more often. And the reason is Google's interpretation of words is not based upon a stored dictionary. It's based upon what people are searching for right now. So the word panic might have a meaning in a dictionary, but if this week there's some congressman somewhere in the world named Panic, and he's in the middle of a scandal, and everybody's searching for him, Google will tend to imply, get things right, which panic you meant in a sentence. So maybe it is just simple formulas of analyzing information. The way every human being is interested in things equates to very much intelligence. Intelligence, certainly consciousness is going to show up on the internet first because the internet has as many computers and nodes as we have neurons in the brain, and it's got as many network connections as we have synapses. So that's the likely place to show up. Well, we have replaced a part of the brain, right? You used to ask a smart professor a difficult question, and now who do you ask? It starts with G-O and it's not God.
They did their hardware and they did the software, Microsoft went a different way. Did Apple ever regret that? Do you think that was a good decision for Apple?
Well, it was an excellent decision for Apple to do hardware and software, but it was accidental. It wasn't like we sat down and said we'd be smart. It's just that I created our first machines, but I did all the hardware on them and all the software. I wrote the computer languages, did it all. So we started out as we built the hardware company, and it comes with the software too. Microsoft didn't have any hardware guys, so they started out with pure software. And they were much smaller than Apple, because Apple, to build products, we had to set up factories around the world. We had to buy thousands of dollars, hundreds of dollars worth of parts, assemble them into a computer, sell it for thousands of dollars. And Microsoft just had a piece of software that they would sell for $100, say, or $50 or $200. And so we were much higher on the Fortune 500. Then there was a period of time where Microsoft passed Apple. Apple kind of stayed stagnant. And the reason we did was we had a huge failure. To this day, our biggest failure is the Macintosh. The world market grew 10 times, and Apple stayed the same size as the Macintosh eventually replaced the Apple II in sales. So it was a time where we lost all those, and Microsoft passed us up, and Steve Jobs was very upset at Bill Gates, because he wanted Bill Gates to say, the Macintosh is the operating system of the future, and we, Microsoft, will just build software. We'll build Windows for it. We'll build Microsoft Office for it. We're not going to compete with Apple in the operating system level. That's what he wanted Bill Gates to do. He said, Bill Gates is going to do this great thing for the world. But Bill Gates did something that made a lot of money instead. So it's hard to say. But Apple's response was, what's good about us is not about them. We're in control of the hardware and the software. We can guarantee the experience better. And I believe that's true. I believe that's true. It leads to other types of problems if you're too close. There are times for openness. Apple's greatest financial successes have been when we were open. Our Apple II product was totally open. We published every schematic, every circuit design, every piece of software was published by Apple. Anybody could look it up and learn what computers were about, how to become a computer expert, it could change their lives, how to write programs. It was all in there. Totally open, expandable. You could plug in device after device after device that we invented, and you could expand the memory hugely. So it was open. Now the Macintosh became very closed under Steve Jobs. His approach was to close things up and totally understand it. And I think it's partly because he wasn't a computer technologist that knew how to build things with like operating systems that can run more than one program at a time. He could, if he could define one thing in his head, that's how he wanted to keep it kept. I think that's why we kept a small phone for such a long time when the world went to larger ones. Steve Jobs, one time I picked him up at the airport. He flew in from Oregon, and we were driving. He says, I got a great name for the company, Apple Computer. And my first response in the car was, what about Apple Records, the Beatles record company? And he said, well, they're a record company, we're a computer company. I said, that's all it takes? Yeah. So if somebody today was building furniture, chairs, and they called it Apple chairs, I'm sure Apple would sue them though. We actually lost hundreds of millions of dollars in lawsuits to the Beatles And then we lost hundreds of millions of dollars suing our lawyers who lost the lawsuit. But we lost it wrong. That's my opinion. We built a computer, not a music device. And they just barely, could call it, get a jury to think it was a music device. I found out later on, the last night of Dancing with the Stars, I sat down next to a doctor who had treated one of my wounds, and the doctor said his brother lived with Steve Jobs on that commune up in Oregon. And his brother's the one who went to Steve Jobs and said, I got a great name for your company. And it fits because very often Steve Jobs would express ideas as though they were out of his head, but he wouldn't say where they came from. And I found many times that turned out to be a case of important ideas. So that might be the origin.
So you mentioned Dancing with the Stars, you were on the